When people remember Syndicate today, they often remember the isometric streets choked with smoke and gunfire, the cold stare of blank-faced agents, or that moment when an entire crowd suddenly fell in behind your trench-coated squad as if they had always belonged to you. But none of that arrived fully formed. The game that Bullfrog released in the early 1990s was the end point of a long, messy, and wonderfully improvised development process, driven by a small team in a converted office in Guildford who were feeling their way towards something they could not entirely describe yet, but knew they wanted to play themselves. To understand how Syndicate was made, you have to understand Bullfrog Productions at that time. Founded in the late 1980s by Peter Molyneux and Les Edgar, Bullfrog had exploded onto the scene with Populous, the so-called God game that let players raise and lower land and toy with the lives of tiny followers. Within a few short years, the studio had followed it with Powermonger and was building the reputation that would soon include Theme Park, Magic Carpet, Dungeon Keeper, and right in the middle of this run, Syndicate. Bullfrog was still relatively small, a few dozen developers packed into the Surrey Research Park on the edge of Guildford, with the air of a band of enthusiasts who had somehow convinced a major publisher to fund the kinds of games they wanted to make for themselves. Sean Cooper, who would become the designer and lead programmer of Syndicate, entered this world after cutting his teeth on Flood, a quirky platformer whose troubled development nonetheless gave him his first full project at Bullfrog. In later recollections, Cooper describes a life that was almost entirely about work. He talks about bringing friends into the office at weekends, setting up network games, and listening to their curses when something in the prototype felt unfair or broken. Then he would change the code and try again. Years later, in an Edge feature and in various interviews, he remembers those days less as a carefully managed project and more as an extended jam session, a group of young developers in their 20s discovering, almost by accident, how to turn their obsessions into a commercial product. The original spark that would become Syndicate came, fittingly, from one of those loose conversations. Cooper recalls a pub discussion soon after Flood, when talk turned toward what they wanted to do next. In his telling, someone voiced a simple, violent desire. They wanted to make a game where you could gun people down in the street, kill crowds of enemies, simply revel in destructive power. That raw impulse collided with Molyneux's taste for high concept design. When Molyneux described the project to magazines in the early 1990s, he framed it as an ambitious near-future management simulation in which rival corporations fought for global dominance, manipulating markets, research, and public perception as much as they deployed troops. At that stage, the working title was Bob, an acronym for Blue and Orange Bloke. The name came from a very literal visual. An early prototype showed squads of simple color-coded figures running around an isometric cityscape. In an interview preserved by Film Stories, Molyneux boasted that Bob would include a world map with around 100 countries and as many as a few hundred cities. Each city would be several times the size of a populous map, alive with tiny people commuting to work along road and rail systems, with a stock market you could manipulate from the safety of a corporate office. He even fantasized about an in-game television channel crammed with fictional adverts that the player could sit and watch. Looking back, you can already see the Bullfrog pattern, a breathless, maximalist pitch that blended simulation, strategy, and world building, followed by the long, pragmatic process of discovering which of those ideas could survive, contact with limited memory, slow processors, and the need to ship a game within a year or two. While Molyneux spun those grand visions to the press, the day-to-day reality inside Bullfrog leaned more toward the immediate thrill of action. Copper and the small group around him built an isometric engine that showed not godlike vistas, but street-level scenes in which teams of agents could patrol, fire weapons, and take cover behind cars and buildings. In those early builds, there were not yet 4 agents, but as many as 8 under the player's control split into blue and orange squads that could be steered around by different human players over the office network. Syndicate, in its embryonic form, was a multiplayer battleground before it was anything else, a way for a handful of developers to compete with one another in the same simulated city. Those multiplayer sessions were more than just after-hours fun. Copper has said that he would invite roughly 5 friends into the office at weekends, hook up the machines, and simply listen. If someone shouted that a weapon felt useless, or that a mission objective was confusing, that would go onto his mental list of changes for Monday. In a later recollection quoted by RetroGaming, he talks about not wanting to go to the pub or chase normal social life. He wanted to work, to iterate on the game in an environment where everyone around him was just as invested. That culture of constant, informal playtesting would shape not only the feel of Syndicate's combat, but also the many ideas that were pared away along the road from Bob to the final game. One of the biggest transformations during development was the way the game narrowed its focus from sprawling management, sim to tightly framed tactical warfare. In those early descriptions, Bob was heavy on systems, stock markets, hiring and firing research budgets, and even that television filled with in-universe adverts. Over time, though, the team realized that the most exciting moments were happening down on the streets, where agents were drawing weapons and civilians were scattering. The global map, corporate finances, and research queues remained, but they were pushed into a supporting role. The primary experience became that of guiding a squad of cybernetically enhanced enforcers through missions that were thrilling precisely because the player had so much direct control over the violence. Technical limits forced other kinds of focus. 8 agents on screen had seemed like a great idea when 2 human players were battling each other across the office network, but testers quickly found that managing that many units in real time made the game confusing and unwieldy. The team experimented with control schemes heavy on icons and indirect commands, the kind of interface that fit with Bullfrog's God game heritage, and magazine previews from the time show packed rows of buttons around the edge of the playfield. Eventually, those layers were stripped back, replaced by a simpler mouse-based system and a set of behavioral sliders. The number of agents was cut down to 4, a compromise that made missions more readable and the controls more manageable without losing the fantasy of leading a small hit squad into hostile territory. The same push and pull between ambition and fun applied to the cities themselves. Early screenshots in Amiga magazines showed environments that looked more like lush military bases, not the neon-drenched concrete jungles people now associate with Syndicate. Over time, the art team, led by people like Paul McLaughlin and Chris Hill, steered the visual style toward something closer to the brutal urbanism of films, such as Blade Runner. Articles and trivia recollections note that they drew inspiration from the very real environment around them, modeling some of the tower blocks and walkways on features of the Surrey Research Park outside their window. That decision gave the cities a grounded, almost banal feel. They were not space stations or alien worlds, but slightly heightened versions of the business parks and shopping districts that players might recognize from their own lives. Underneath the isometric veneer, Syndicate's city simulation was both more modest and more clever than the early hype suggested. The tiny civilians who wandered the pavements did not have fully simulated jobs and home lives, but they had enough behavioral rules to create the illusion of a living population. They walked along predefined paths, reacted to gunfire, and could be coaxed or coerced into following the player's squad. Coper has admitted, with a certain amount of amusement, that the oft-repeated promise that each citizen had a full routine shuttling from home to office and back was mostly promotional exaggeration. Yet the team's knack for choosing the right details gave players the feeling of being inside a functioning dystopian city, even though much of it was smoke and mirrors. The fiction of the Syndicate world grew in parallel with that simulation. The manual, rather than the game itself, carried most of the story. It painted a future in which nation-states had ceded power to mega-corporations, and a technology called the chip had been implanted in the population's necks, altering their perception of reality and making them more pliable. The player, as an executive of one of these corporations, was explicitly cast as a villain, directing squads of cybernetic agents to assassinate rivals, kidnap scientists, and pacify rebellious territories. In later essays and retrospectives, writers have connected this to the wave of cyberpunk literature and cinema that had begun with authors like William Gibson and films such as Blade Runner, and to the darker turn in British game design that relished putting players on the side of institutions rather than rebels. Within the studio, that tone seems to have suited the team perfectly. Cooper has said, in interviews later echoed by Edge, and by writers like Ryan Lambie, that the essence of the game was simple, killing people with big guns. He has joked about wanting to see bodies flung through the air by explosions, and about being frustrated by the limits of available memory and processing power. Some of the most gruesome ideas stayed on the cutting room floor, but the weapons that survived, like the minigun and the Gauss gun, became iconic precisely because the developers tuned them by feel, watching colleagues grin when they finally behaved in a satisfyingly brutal way. The Persuadertron, perhaps the most infamous gadget in the game, was born from the same throwaway creativity. According to Cooper's recollections in later features and documentaries, the device began as an offhand suggestion in the office. What if there was a way to brainwash civilians and turn them into an obedient following? Instead of agonizing over law or balance on paper, the team simply implemented a prototype. Instantly, it changed the way missions played. Players discovered they could stroll through a city, collecting a growing snake of mind-controlled followers, using them as a human shield or as a way to overwhelm enemy agents. The Persuadertron was simple in mechanical terms, but devastating in terms of theme. It dramatized in a single mechanic the idea that ordinary people were nothing but disposable resources in the war between corporations. Multiplayer, which had been so central to the game's early life, suffered a harsher fate. As Moby Games and later retrospectives summarize from developer interviews, the team originally built Syndicate as a network game first, and only later derived the single-player missions from those tests. It played brilliantly over the local network at Bullfrog, but when Electronic Arts quality assurance teams tried to run it on their own internal systems, they struggled to get reliable performance. With deadlines looming and the game already ambitious on other fronts, the decision was made to strip out the multiplayer from the initial release. The designers were disappointed, but the code and concepts did not disappear entirely. They resurfaced later in the American Revolt expansion, which restored a form of network play alongside a set of hard-as-nails missions aimed at expert players. One of the quieter but crucial elements of the game's identity was its soundscape. Composer Russell Shaw was relatively early in his career when he wrote Syndicate's music. Yet the score he produced, with its brooding synth textures and occasional sharp stabs of melody, helped cement the mood of a world run by uncaring corporations. Later, in a documentary by the Honor Retrotip channel, and in coverage by sites like Time Extension, Shaw talks about matching the cold, clinical violence on screen with tracks that could sit in the background for long stretches and then swell during moments of chaos. Sound effects, too, had to do a lot of work within tight memory budgets, with each roar of a minigun or whoosh of a flamethrower carefully tuned to feel weighty on modest speakers. If Bullfrog's internal culture had been more rigid, many of these details might never have made it into the game. Cooper has repeatedly said, in podcast appearances and interviews, that there was a sense of freedom within the studio during Syndicate's development. In an Arcade Attack episode devoted to his career, the hosts introduce him as one of Bullfrog's key figures and frame the conversation around what it was like birthing Syndicate and watching the company eventually fade. That word, birthing, captures something important. Syndicate was not designed in a top-down fashion from a fixed document, but rather emerged from years of collaborative tinkering, informal feedback, and an atmosphere in which designers, artists and programmers could add wild ideas to the pot and see which ones survived contact with their colleagues' laughter or groans. Outside that bubble, the business landscape was already shifting. Electronic Arts, which published Syndicate, would go on to acquire Bullfrog outright in the mid-1990s. Writers like Jimmy Maher and the CRPG Addict have pointed out that the sale transformed the lives of the roughly 36 people working at Bullfrog, and that in later years the studio struggled to maintain the same degree of independence it had enjoyed when making Syndicate. During the early 90s, though, the relationship seems to have been relatively hands-off, with Electronic Arts stepping in more forcefully only when technical realities like the fragile state of network play threatened the company's schedules or reputation. By the time Syndicate finally shipped in the summer of 1993, first on MS-DOS and Amiga, and then on a succession of other formats, it had traveled a long way from that pub conversation about simply gunning people down. The world map and research system survived as echoes of the earlier Bob concept, but the heart of the experience lay in those compact, urban missions. Visually, the team squeezed a surprising amount of atmosphere out of limited color palettes, using dithering and clever shading to make the isometric streets feel grimy, rain-soaked and alive. Technically, the game balanced the need to track multiple agents, civilians, vehicles, and bullets with the strict memory ceilings of home computers and consoles. Creatively, it fused British black humour, cyberpunk cynicism, and the tactile pleasure of real-time tactics into something that felt unlike anything else. Looking back from decades later, Coper has called Syndicate a highlight of his career, praising not only the finished game but the working relationships he enjoyed with colleagues such as level designer Alex Trowers and producer Peter Molyneux. In one interview, he describes it as a kind of small masterpiece, a project that captured the energy of a young studio at the height of its creative confidence. That sentiment is echoed in the long-form documentary coverage that has appeared in recent years, where former team members sit down to dissect design decisions, laugh about bugs, and remember late nights in the office. For them, the making of Syndicate is not just a series of technical milestones, but a shared story of risk, camaraderie, and a certain gleeful disregard for polite boundaries. All of this mattered because it shaped the game that players actually encountered. The tug-of-war between sprawling management, sim, and immediate action produced a structure where you could pore over research graphs one moment, and then be dumped into a city where everything went wrong at once. The decision to favor a small squad of agents over unwieldy armies made the violence feel personal and legible. The half-real, half-faked city simulation made it easy to project stories onto tiny crowds, even though their routines were simple. The Persuadertron, the chip backstory, the faceless corporations, and the highly tuned weapons all emerged from that same stew of ambitious ideas, technical compromise, and constant multiplayer playtesting. To really appreciate how Syndicate plays, you have to carry in your head this history of Bob, of network games across office desks, of endless cuts and improvisations. Only then does the finished game feel less like an isolated classic and more like what it truly is, the crystallized memory of a particular studio, at a particular moment, building the most sinister toy box they could imagine. Part 2, understanding how Syndicate was born out of Bullfrog. Experimental culture helps explain why actually playing it feels so different from most other strategy games of its era. The game does not simply ask you to push counters around on a map, and it certainly does not offer the kind of detached, morally neutral experience that many strategy titles lean on. Instead, it throws you into the role of a corporate executive who commands a tiny squad of cybernetic agents and treats entire cities as disposable sandboxes for your experiments in control. To talk about Syndicate's gameplay is to talk about that uneasy mixture of power and discomfort, about the way the game constantly invites you to enjoy what you are doing, and then, almost in the same breath, quietly reminds you how monstrous it all is. When you first start a campaign, the game does not place you on the streets at all. It opens with the interface that defines the overarching structure of play, the corporate office and the world map. On that map, the planet is carved into a patchwork of territories, each colored to show which syndicate currently controls it. Your own organization begins with a small foothold, usually in Europe, from which you are expected to expand, one mission at a time, until your color covers the globe. It looks a little like a digital board game, almost like a grim parody of a world conquest title, but every territory on that map corresponds to an individual mission down at street level. To take a region, you accept the job tied to it, drop your agents into the city, and try to carry out whatever ruthless objective your corporate handlers have set. That strategic layer is much more than a simple level select screen. Each territory under your control generates income as its population is squeezed for tax. In between missions, you can nudge those tax sliders upward, turning the screws to collect more funding for research and equipment. Push them too far, and the game responds by simulating unrest. The local people, represented only by a mood statistic and occasional rebellions, may rise up against your regime, forcing you to drop into a city again to pacify the area. Players and critics have pointed out that this tax system is not as deep as it first appears, and that it can be gamed or even ignored once you have enough money. But the very fact that your income is explicitly described as taxation on a miserable, chipped population reinforces the feeling that you are running a callous corporate empire rather than a noble resistance. From this global view, you drift into the heart of Syndicate's strategy gameplay, the management screen where you assemble and upgrade your team of agents. At the start, you have a pool of 8 cybernetic operatives sitting in cryogenic storage, blank-faced and waiting for orders. Before each mission, you choose up to 4 of them to send into the field. The choice is not about classes or personalities. These agents are not individual characters with backstories. Instead, they are interchangeable bodies that you shape through cybernetic modifications. You spend corporate funds on new arms, legs, chest plates, eyes, hearts, and brain implants, each of which comes in increasingly powerful iterations. Better legs let an agent sprint faster, reinforced chests soak up more gunfire, and allow them to carry heavier weapons without slowing down. Upgraded eyes and brains sharpen their reactions and accuracy. Over time, you turn your initial group of disposable recruits into a terrifying quartet of murder machines, and you do it through a calm, almost clinical interface that feels deliberately detached from the chaos they will unleash on the streets. Cybernetics are only half of the preparation. The other half is the research system. Any funds not immediately spent on upgrades or weapons can be diverted into research projects that slowly unlock more advanced technology. The Amiga magazines of the time explain how you can invest in 2 main research categories: modifications for your agents' bodies and equipment for their hands. Equipment in turn splits into automatic weapons, heavy hardware, and miscellaneous gadgets, each leading to new toys if you feed them enough cash. The more money you assign to a project, the faster the research bar fills. That means the strategic decision is not simply which weapon you want, but how badly you want it, and whether you are willing to starve other projects to get it sooner. An impatient executive can funnel vast sums into development to pull powerful guns and implants into the early game, whereas a cautious player might spread their budget across many lines and accept that certain devices will not appear until later in the campaign. Weaponry, of course, is at the core of Syndicate's moment-to-moment play, and the Arsenal Bullfrog, created remains one of the game's most memorable features. You begin with pistols and shotguns, reliable but underwhelming tools that force you to pick targets carefully and avoid open confrontations with better armed foes. As research progresses, you obtain submachine guns that spray bullets down crowded streets, long-range rifles for precise assassinations, flamethrowers that lay down writhing streams of burning gel, lasers that slice into vehicles, time bombs for targeted demolition, and, towering over them all, the infamous minigun and Gauss gun. Contemporary magazine articles describe the minigun as a motor-driven machine gun that becomes most devastating when fired in short, controlled bursts, and the Gauss gun as a kind of portable rocket launcher capable of turning tanks and crowds alike into smears of debris. Players still talk about the first time they clamped down on the trigger of a minigun and watched a busy street empty in seconds, or fired a Gauss projectile into a car and saw the explosion throw civilians into the air like ragdolls. Yet, it is the Persuadertron that perhaps best captures what Syndicate is trying to do with its mechanics. On paper, it is just another item in the equipment list, a device with an extremely short range that emits some kind of chemical or signal. In practice, it is the tool that allows you to subvert the very population your corporation has chipped. When an agent with a Persuadertron walks close to an unarmed civilian, the device quietly flips whatever switch is buried in their neck. Their sprite stops wandering and falls in line behind your squad, eyes still blank, now completely under your control. The more people you persuade, the more potent the device becomes. Amiga Format explained that after you have folded roughly 16 ordinary civilians into your new cult, you gain the ability to sway a police officer as well. With twice that number shuffling behind you in a dazed parade, you can even claim enemy agents, permanently stealing them out of the cryo-tanks of rival corporations. Every converted person who survives until the end of a mission brings in a small cash reward. But the real use of this human chain is tactical. A long tail of brainwashed civilians acts as a mobile shield against gunfire, a distraction for hostile agents and a visual signal of how thoroughly you have violated the supposed neutrality of the city's inhabitants. Once your agents are upgraded and armed, you finally click on a flashing territory on the world map and drop into the streets. Here, Syndicate's perspective shifts to its distinctive isometric view. The city unfolds at a diagonal angle, buildings rising in chunky patterns, roads cutting across the screen, trains rattling along elevated rails, cars gliding through intersections. Your team appears as a group of tiny trench-coated figures at the edge of the map, each one tagged with a number that corresponds to a set of control buttons. The missions themselves come in several flavors. Some are straightforward assassinations in which you must locate and eliminate rival agents or local leaders. Others ask you to kidnap scientists, escort defectors to extraction points, rescue corporate assets under fire, or pacify rebellious territories by wiping out every hostile presence in sight. Although critics have sometimes argued that many missions boil down to go to this point and kill everyone who stands in your way, the variety of layouts and the context set by the briefing screen lend them a surprising degree of flavor, especially when you approach them with different tools and levels of aggression. Control of your agents is simple in principle, but rich in practice. You can select them individually, giving separate orders to each, or band them together into a single group and move them as a pack. Left-clicking on the ground sends the selected agents walking or running in that direction. Clicking on a pedestrian or enemy sets them as a target. If your weapons are drawn, your squad will open fire as soon as they have a clear shot. There is no traditional pause and command system in the original computer versions, which means that every decision you make happens in real time, with bullets already flying and civilians already screaming. That real-time nature is what led some reviewers to describe Syndicate as an arcade strategy game, or as a hybrid between a shootout and a board game. You are always juggling positioning, line of sight, weapon ranges, and the risk of hitting your own persuaded followers, and you are doing it under pressure as the city reacts to your presence. To ease that pressure, Bullfrog added a small but important set of agent behavior controls in the form of sliders. Along the bottom of the screen, you can adjust 3 drug-like statistics for your squad: adrenaline, perception, and intelligence. Raising adrenaline makes your agents move faster and shoot more aggressively, but it also risks pushing them into a kind of berserk state where they become harder to handle. Boosting perception heightens their awareness, improving accuracy and reaction times, which can mean the difference between spotting an enemy agent across a plaza or walking blindly into an ambush. Tweaking intelligence influences how much initiative they take when left on their own. With high intelligence settings, they may return fire automatically or seek cover when attacked. With lower settings, they behave more like remote-controlled puppets, doing only what you explicitly tell them. The thematic implication is chilling. You are literally dosing your agents with combat drugs, sliding their internal chemistry around as if it were just another resource, and the game reflects this both in their performance and in the little twitchy animation of their status bars. The city itself is designed as a kind of intricate playground for these mechanics. Civilians wander along pavements, waiting at crossings, occasionally boarding trains or entering buildings. Police patrols move through the streets in pairs, indifferent to your presence, until you draw weapons or start killing people. Enemy agents lurk near objectives or patrol key choke points, often armed with better hardware than you have at that stage, ready to pounce on any careless move. Vehicles can be hijacked with a click, letting your squad pile into a car or truck and roar off down the road, guns still blazing out of the windows. Reviewers singled out these details as the touches that made Syndicate cities feel alive, the way a terrified pedestrian could end up splattered on the hood of a car, the way police only reacted when you visibly raised the level of violence, the way a train might rumble past just as a firefight spilled across the tracks. At its best, this combination of systems produces missions that feel almost like improvised heist movies. Imagine dropping into a densely built metropolis with a squad whose legs and chests you have heavily upgraded, but who still rely on mid-tier guns. Your briefing tells you to capture a scientist who is meeting with rival operatives in a cafe on the far side of the map. You could arm your group with flamethrowers and march directly there, but the risk of collateral damage and the likelihood of drawing every hostile agent on the map might be too high. Instead, you walk your squad through the streets with weapons holstered, blend into the crowd, and quietly use the Persuadertron on civilians as you pass. By the time you approach the cafe, a long tail of glassy-eyed citizens stretches behind you. When enemy agents finally open fire, their first shots chew through this human shield. You respond by unleashing a fusillade from your submachine guns, then pile the survivors into a stolen car and tear through the nearest checkpoint, hoping your improved legs and high adrenaline settings will let you outrun the pursuing police. The game never scripts that kind of scenario. It emerges from the way its tools and behaviors intersect. Of course, Syndicate is rarely that elegant Modern retrospectives, including long comment threads from players revisiting the game decades later, often complain that many missions degenerate into scrappy street brawls in which every enemy on the map seems to converge on your position the moment you fire a shot. The stealthier possibilities suggested by the Persuadertron, disguises and careful movement are difficult to realize consistently. partly because the interface for fine control is clumsy by modern standards, and partly because the artificial intelligence reacts in blunt, aggressive ways. Some veteran players argue that the safest tactic on higher difficulties is simply to station your 4 agents in a tight group at a defensible corner of the map and lure enemies into a storm of overlapping gunfire rather than attempting elaborate flanking maneuvers. This has led some critics to describe the campaign as more repetitive than it first appears, with the truly memorable moments emerging less from varied objectives and more from the unpredictable chaos of the city's reactions. The structure of the campaign does, however, try to keep you thinking about long-term consequences rather than just immediate gunfights, because you can often choose between several neighboring territories for your next move. You have some flexibility in how you approach global domination. You might pick missions that look easier or that offer particularly useful rewards, bypassing tougher ones until your agents are better equipped. Each success not only gives you control of a region and its tax revenue, it also sometimes adds new technologies if you manage to steal advanced weapons from enemy forces and bring them home intact. Amiga reviewers pointed out that it is possible to acquire a Gauss gun early in the campaign simply by killing an enemy agent who carries one and surviving the mission, effectively leapfrogging the normal research tree. That kind of emergent shortcut encourages you to treat every encounter as an opportunity, not just an obstacle. Platform differences add another dimension to the gameplay conversation. On powerful personal computers of the time, Syndicate ran at a brisk pace that emphasized its twitchy, real-time character. On lower-end home computers, reviewers complained that heavy action, especially explosions and vehicles, could drag the frame rate down, making missions feel sluggish, but also unintentionally making them a bit easier to manage. Console versions, such as the Super Nintendo adaptation, took more radical liberties. That version transformed the experience into something closer to a direct action game, with larger sprites and more immediate control of individual agents, preserving some of the original ideas but reshaping them to suit a gamepad and a younger audience. Watching or listening to interviews with Sean Cooper and various long-form video retrospectives, you get the sense that the definitive experience, the one the team tuned obsessively via Office multiplayer sessions, was always the computer version with mouse control, free from the compromises required by weaker hardware or more restricted controller layouts. Beneath the mechanical specifics, Syndicate's gameplay communicates its themes with a surprising bluntness. Every major system reinforces the idea that you are not the hero here. You treat agents as assets to be modified, drugged, and discarded. You treat civilians as a resource, whether as taxable bodies on a world map or as meat shields for your Persuadatron. Even the tax interface, a simple set of sliders and numbers, is framed as a question of how much suffering you are prepared to inflict in pursuit of faster research. The game never scolds you for any of this. It simply presents the tools and lets you discover how effective cruelty can be. That hands-off attitude is part of what makes the gameplay still feel unsettling decades later. Modern players writing on blogs and forums often remark that they found themselves trying to role-play a good executive, attempting to minimize collateral damage, and that the game responded by punishing them with harder missions, slower progress, and leaner research budgets. Syndicate is mechanically honest about the incentives of its world. Brutal solutions are generally the most efficient ones. If there is a single phrase that captures Syndicate's gameplay, it might be real-time tactics with a guilty conscience. Moment to moment, you are juggling agent positions, weapon ranges, line of sight, and fast-moving enemies in tight urban arenas. Between missions, you are tweaking tax rates, approving cybernetic upgrades, planning research priorities, and deciding which part of the world to subjugate next. Both layers feed into one another. A clever research decision pays off on the streets when you unveil a new weapon that changes how you approach firefights. A disastrous mission in which your agents are killed or captured feeds back into the strategic layer by thinning your pool of operatives and draining your funds. The constant loop of preparation, execution, and consequence creates a rhythm that can be deeply compelling, even when the individual missions blur together. This rhythm is precisely what Bullfrog's designers honed during those weekend multiplayer sessions in Guildford. In interviews and documentaries, Sean Cooper describes watching friends curse the slow pace of their agents, complain about the weakness of early weapons, or laugh at the absurd spectacle of a Persuadertron parade snaking across the map. Each reaction triggered tweaks to movement speeds, weapon damage, artificial intelligence, behaviors, and mission layouts. Over time, through that iterative process, Syndicate's gameplay became what players remember today, a strange, intoxicating mixture of cool-headed planning and messy violence, wrapped in a user interface that feels as if it belongs in the boardroom of a monstrous, futuristic conglomerate. To understand the legacy of Syndicate and the sequels and reimaginings that followed, you first have to feel that rhythm for yourself, the shift from detached executive staring at a world map to panicked field commander, dragging a few trench-coated silhouettes through a city that is rapidly turning into an inferno of your own making. Part 3, when Syndicate left the Bullfrog offices and reached players around the world, it carried with it all the messiness, ambition, and dark humor that had shaped its development. On paper, it was a difficult game to market, an isometric, real-time tactical strategy title in which you played not a hero, but the faceless executive of a brutal corporation. In practice, that unusual pitch became one of its greatest strengths. Reviewers and players had simply not seen anything quite like it. The early 1990s were filled with colorful platformers, bright arcade conversions, and grand, somewhat noble strategy games. Into that landscape marched Syndicate, trench coat flapping and minigun roaring, inviting people to revel in corporate cruelty while quietly asking what that said about them. Contemporary reviews, particularly in British and European magazines, tended to focus first on the atmosphere. Critics admired the way the isometric cities seemed to hum with life, from the tiny trains rattling over elevated tracks to the crowds of civilians milling around glassy office blocks and dingy streets. They pointed out that the game's relatively muted color palette and careful shading made its world feel more grounded than the cartoonish science fiction common at the time. Even in screenshots printed on slightly fuzzy paper, you could feel the weight of those concrete plazas and steel walkways. Many reviewers reserved special praise for the way smoke curled from explosions, how bodies tumbled when hit by a Gauss projectile, and how weather effects lent missions a damp, melancholy tone. Beneath that visual appeal, critics also found a game that, while sometimes clumsy, was captivatingly intense. Strategy fans liked the mixture of long-term planning and short-term improvisation. They wrote about the satisfaction of carefully shepherding research projects, saving up for a new cybernetic upgrade or weapon, and then unleashing it in a mission where it fundamentally changed the way you could approach an objective. Some reviewers compared the thrill of finally fielding a squad equipped with high-level legs, chests, and miniguns to the moment in a role-playing game when your party suddenly steps into a higher tier of power. That sense of progression turned the campaign into more than just a string of disconnected missions. Yet the game was not universally praised. Even sympathetic critics acknowledged that the controls could be awkward, especially for players unused to real-time tactics. Without a pause and command feature, some people felt overwhelmed by the need to manage 4 agents at once in chaotic firefights. Pathfinding could be unreliable, leading to agents wandering into danger when told to move along tight walkways or around vehicles. Others complained about difficulty spikes, particularly in later missions where enemy agents appeared heavily armed and aggressive, eager to swarm your squad the moment you revealed yourself. For some reviewers, these issues were minor blemishes on an otherwise compelling design. For others, they turned Syndicate into a love-it-or-hate-it experience. Thrilling for those willing to wrestle with its systems and frustrating for those expecting smoother, more accessible controls. Violence, inevitably, became another point of discussion. By the standards of later decades, Syndicate's pixelated carnage seems almost tame, but at the time it felt shocking. Players could set entire streets ablaze with flamethrowers, mow down fleeing civilians with miniguns, or detonate explosives in crowded plazas. The Persuadatron mechanic, which encouraged you to collect long chains of mind-controlled civilians and then use them as a buffer, drew particular comment. Some critics admired the way the game's mechanics and fiction aligned to present a genuinely unsettling vision of corporate power. Others worried that it invited players to enjoy cruelty a little too much. In some regions, the game attracted age ratings, scrutiny, and moral panic, lumped alongside other titles that were accused of desensitizing young people to on-screen violence. Interestingly, Syndicate's moral ambiguity often ended up being one of the aspects that made it memorable rather than disposable, where many action games of the era used thin excuses to justify endless killing, rescuing innocents, defending nations, saving worlds. Syndicate was disarmingly honest about the role it cast you in. You were enriching your corporation, manipulating populations through implanted chips, and eliminating rivals by any means necessary. Some reviewers wrote that this frankness gave the game an unusually adult tone, not in the juvenile sense of blood and swearing, but in the sense that it treated players as capable of handling a bleak, satirical vision of the future. That impression only deepened as players discovered how the tax and research systems quietly rewarded ruthless efficiency over idealism. The game's commercial performance reflected this mix of controversy and fascination. Syndicate was not a throwaway cult item. It sold well across personal computers and gained enough momentum to justify ports to a wide range of platforms, from home computers to consoles, and even more exotic hardware. Each adaptation came with its own compromises and quirks. On some machines, the graphics were simplified and the frame rate dropped under heavy action. On others, the user interface was redesigned to work with gamepads rather than mice, shifting the emphasis slightly toward direct action and away from precise tactical control. While purists tended to favor the original computer versions, the very fact that the game appeared in so many forms helped fix its imagery in the minds of a wide audience. The trench coats, the isometric streets, the cold corporate logos. Bullfrog and its publisher moved quickly to build on that success. Not long after the original release, an expansion appeared under the title American Revolt, aimed squarely at experienced players. It offered a set of new missions that were notoriously difficult. Enemies were more aggressive, better armed and more numerous, and the maps pushed players into situations where they had to use every trick the game offered, from careful manipulation of agent drugs to creative abuse of the Persuadatron. The expansion also reintroduced multiplayer support that had been trimmed from the initial release, allowing small groups of players to face off in the same dense urban environments that had served as Bullfrog's internal playground. Though American Revolt never achieved the same wide recognition as the base game, for fans it quickly became a kind of unofficial hard mode, evidence that the designers themselves were aware of how cruel their world could be. A few years later, Bullfrog returned to the setting in a more substantial way with Syndicate Wars. Released in the mid-1990s, that sequel pushed the concept forward on several fronts. Technically, it adopted a more advanced engine with rotating camera angles, more detailed environments, and a heavier emphasis on three-dimensional destruction. Entire buildings could be brought crashing down under sustained fire, and the battlefields felt more chaotic and dynamic than before. Thematically, The story explored the idea of rebellion against the very corporate system that had defined the first game, introducing rival factions with their own agendas and ideological motivations. Players could choose to side either with the ruling Syndicate or with a zealous cult dedicated to liberating humanity from the chip technology, adding a new wrinkle to the moral landscape. Syndicate Wars received a warm, if slightly more mixed, critical reception. Some reviewers celebrated its increased complexity and spectacle, praising the destructible environments and the sense that the world was even more hostile and unpredictable. Others missed the sharper focus and relative clarity of the original game's isometric perspective. The rotating camera, while impressive, sometimes made it harder to read the battlefield, and the added layers of interface could feel intimidating. Still, the sequel cemented Syndicate as a series rather than a one-off curiosity. For a period in the mid to late 1990s, the name conjured a specific image in the minds of players: rain, streets, cybernetic agents, and the thrill of orchestrating urban warfare from a godlike vantage point. Despite this momentum, the series then went quiet. Bullfrog itself was changing under the ownership of Electronic Arts, and the industry around it was shifting toward fully three-dimensional action games, first-person shooters, and cinematic adventures. The kind of isometric real-time tactics that Syndicate specialized in began to feel, to some executives at least, like a relic of an earlier era. When the name finally resurfaced in a major way, it did so in an unexpected form. In the early years of the new millennium's second decade, Electronic Arts commissioned a new game simply titled Syndicate, developed by the Swedish studio Starbreeze. Rather than a spiritual successor to the old real-time tactics design, this project reimagined the franchise as a first-person shooter with heavy emphasis on cooperative play, cinematic presentation, and fast-paced gunfights. The reboot had its own qualities. It featured slick visuals, detailed weapon models, and an updated take on the chip concept, allowing players to hack enemies and the environment in real time. Cooperative missions evoke the old fantasy of running operations as a small squad inside hostile territory, and some critics enjoyed its blend of shooting and cybernetic gadgetry. However, for many fans of the original games, the shift in genre felt jarring. What they loved about Syndicate was not only its branding or its futuristic trappings, but the very specific feel of orchestrating violence from an isometric perspective, juggling real-time tactics and cold-blooded business decisions. A first-person shooter, no matter how polished, could not easily recreate the sensation of looking down at a city full of tiny figures and bending it to your will. As a result, the reboot's reception was notably divided. Some reviewers judged it on its own merits and found an enjoyable, if somewhat conventional, shooter. Others could not separate it from the legacy of Bullfrog's work, and criticized it for discarding the tactical depth and moral discomfort that had given the original its character. For those players, the new game felt less like a revival of Syndicate and more like a different project wearing a familiar logo. Over time, the reboot's impact faded, while discussions of the series tended to return to the older titles that had defined its identity. In parallel with this official history, Syndicate exerted a quieter but persistent influence on other developers. The idea of controlling a small squad of augmented operatives in a dystopian city found echoes in numerous later games, from squad-based cyberpunk titles to real-time tactics, experiments in different settings. Even when designers did not explicitly cite Syndicate as an inspiration, you could see its fingerprints on games that combined high-level strategy with intimate, street-level action. Some borrowed its bleak corporate satire, others its emphasis on emergent chaos in crowded urban environments. The basic fantasy of sending a heavily armed team into the heart of a living city proved fertile enough to be reinterpreted again and again. One of the clearest examples of this legacy came from some of the people who had worked on the series themselves. Decades after the original release, a group of developers with connections to the old Bullfrog projects embarked on a spiritual successor that would capture the feel of Syndicate without using the name. That project, released in the second decade of the 21st century, placed players once again in control of a small squad of agents prowling through a rain-soaked corporate metropolis. It leaned heavily into open-ended missions, emergent encounters, and the fantasy of being a powerful but morally dubious force in a world run by competing mega-corporations. While smaller in scale than modern blockbusters, it demonstrated how enduring the core idea remained and how passionate the fan base still was for this particular blend of tactics and theme. Meanwhile, the original game continued to live on through re-releases and emulation. Digital distribution platforms eventually made Syndicate and Syndicate Wars available to new generations of players, often bundled with compatibility tweaks that allowed them to run on contemporary hardware. Retrospective articles, video essays, and podcast episodes revisited the series, placing it in the wider context of 90s game design and cyberpunk culture. Commentators marveled at how much atmosphere Bullfrog had wrung out of limited technology, and how boldly the game had cast players as villains in an era when most mainstream titles still clung to simple heroism. The isometric graphics aged gracefully, with their crisp angles and moody palettes, retaining a certain charm long after more realistic early three-dimensional games had begun to look clumsy. These retrospectives also highlighted the ways in which Syndicate had been ahead of its time. Its depiction of privatized governance, in which corporations effectively replaced nation-states, resonated uneasily in an age of rampant globalization and tech company dominance. The chip concept, which allowed syndicates to control what citizens saw and felt, seemed eerily prescient in light of later discussions about algorithmic manipulation, social media echo chambers, and surveillance capitalism. What had once been a slightly exaggerated dystopian joke started to feel uncomfortably close to reality. Players revisiting the game found that its satire had only sharpened with age, and that the experience of marching a squad of agents through a chipped city now carried extra layers of meaning. At the same time, nostalgia for Bullfrog as a studio lent the game a special aura. In many histories of British game development, Bullfrog appears as a symbol of a particular moment when small teams could tackle wildly ambitious concepts and somehow make them work. Populous, Theme Park, Magic Carpet, Dungeon Keeper, and Syndicate all shared a willingness to blend genres and to trust players to navigate complex systems without excessive hand-holding. When fans and former employees talk about that era, Syndicate often stands out as one of the purest expressions of the studio's sensibilities, mechanically experimental, tonally dark, laced with black humor, and not especially worried about whether it might offend or unsettle. Today, when people speak about the legacy of Syndicate, they rarely talk about sales charts or exact review scores. Instead, they talk about memories. They remember the first time they used a Persuadatron and realized they could lead an entire city block's worth of civilians to their doom. They recall missions that spiraled out of control, with cars exploding, police swarming, and agents barely making it to an extraction point with a captured scientist in tow. They remember the chill of realizing that the game never once asked them to justify any of this, that it simply assumed they were willing to do whatever it took to paint the world map in their color. Those memories and the emotions tied to them are the real inheritance that Syndicate has left to the medium. If you trace a line from those memories through the decades that followed, you can see the game's influence in unexpected places. You can see it in later real-time tactics titles that embrace chaotic urban battlefields. You can see it in cyberpunk stories that foreground corporations as the true antagonists. You can even see it in debates about whether games should allow players to inhabit explicitly villainous roles without overt moral commentary. In each of these conversations, Syndicate appears as a quiet ancestor, an early example of how far interactive systems can push players toward uncomfortable questions simply by letting them act within a particular set of rules. In the end, that may be the clearest measure of its legacy. Syndicate is not just remembered as a product of its year or as a stepping stone in Bullfrog's catalogue. It is remembered as an experience that lingers, a game whose mechanics, tone and imagery fuse into something uniquely unsettling and strangely exhilarating. It asked players to become the architect of a corporate dystopia and discovered, with a certain bleak amusement, how many of them were willing to accept the job.